Hello, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Doth Protest, a podcast on Reformation, history, and theology. James and I are here with our guest today, Dr. Wade Johnston, Reverend Dr. Wade Johnston, and we'll call you Wade for the show because in the emails you
That
said it
would
was
be
okay.
preferred. Yeah, Wade is
Yeah,
good.
we'll be casual. But Wade, thanks for coming on. We just to give our listeners kind of an intro to you, if they don't already know you, because you have a podcast called Let the Bird Fly, and you write for 1517 as well. And just for our listeners, Wade Johnston is a assistant professor of history and theology at Wisconsin Lutheran College in Milwaukee. And he has served in parish ministry before in the town of Saginaw, Michigan, where yours truly is from, and lived for many years before he ended up in the Bayou. And he again he but now we're having Wade on for this show to talk about his recent book that was published that is keeping along with the theme we've been on the podcast the last couple months on um, Lutheranism after Luther, particularly like what the rest of the 16th century looked like. And the book that I'm referring to from Wade Johnston is a recent publication, Life Under the Cross, a biography of the Reformer. And this is actually on my notes, one of my preliminary questions, because I've read about this guy so often, and I've always pronounced
I'm
him.
ready for. I bet I can. I was gonna guess that was what it was. How to
Yeah.
say it?
Yeah, but how do you pronounce his name?
How do I pronounce? I pronounce it however people want me to. So that's actually an interesting story. When I was for my dissertation defense, every committee member, all five, were positive that they knew how to say his name correctly, and all of them except for one had different pronunciations from all the others. So I
This
just
is your
kept
committee?
yes, and I kept
Okay.
my committee member from Erasmus in the Netherlands. He was actually a German, but his wife was a Romanian, I believe, and he said they have the best Latin pronunciation, and he thought it was one way. And so there was all these differences of opinion. So I just kept changing how I said it throughout the defense, and I got through. So I will probably just mimic what you say, but I usually say Flacius, or in Wisconsin we like to say Flacius. But there's
Okay.
Flacius, Flacius, Flacius. Flacius is my favorite as far as I think it rolls off the tongue, but Flacius is what I will usually say.
I will say Flacius is how I've often pronounced it, but it's not just Flacius. His full name is Matthias. I think I got that. That's an apostle. That's easy. Matthias Flacius, as I'd say it, but we'll say Flacius. And the third name,
Illyricus. Yeah,
Illyricus. Oh, that's pretty
Illyricus.
phonetic. Okay.
And the
So,
fourth name, Albanensis.
Yeah. He likes to add references to where he's from, and so he sometimes adds the fourth too. Yeah.
okay. So again, for listeners, full title, Life Under the Cross, a biography of the Reformer Matthias Flacius Illyricus. I think I did well there. Okay. I
You did
think I
well.
got, okay. Wade Johnston, he has a PhD from, it was joint institutionally granted from Central Michigan University and then Erasmus University in Rotterdam. That must have been interesting because I know Central Michigan. I mean, I'm being from Michigan. I know CMU a lot. And did you like travel back and forth from the two places, or is it
So
like a
yeah, we'll fire up chips first of all. Yeah, and I did grad school. I was in the parish. I did most of my grad school, and it started off just kind of on a lark as a way to supplement parish ministry, and I kind of enjoyed learning. And so Central was about 45 minutes from my parish, and so I was just taking classes there, and then got to know a lot of the history professors pretty well, and they kind of encouraged have you thought about the PhD program? And I said, well, I'm a parish pastor. I want to be a parish pastor, you know. And they said, well, you think you could make this work? They, their PhDs, they have, at that point, I think it was 4 schools that they did partnerships with so that you would kind of get experience on at both institutions. One was Strathclyde in Scotland. That would have been fun, but the scheduling with that one didn't work. One was Jena in Germany. That would have been super fun because Flacius was at Jena. But German semesters also would have been difficult to align with parish ministry. And then Erasmus in the Netherlands. And it was kind of fun to think about studying Flacius at a place named after Erasmus. But I that worked out timing wise as well. And so my family was over there for a semester, and then I had some back and forth to Europe for research and other things. But otherwise, they were very kind and gracious, and we were able to work on a lot of it. I was able to stay involved virtually. Thankfully, I was doing it at a time where that was possible
Right.
on both sides of that. But it was a real blessing because to get the differences in approaches and emphases at both institutions was kind of fun. The Europeans are much more cool with like just grabbing a little bit from everything, being interdisciplinary and doing religious stuff without, feeling too awkward about it. And so it's fun to see the differences in approaches in both places.
That is interesting. Yeah, a little bit out. Yeah, so that's cool that you were able to yeah, in a time before things were as virtual as they are now. Yeah, so anyways, he and just to kind of finish off on kind of your background, you taught a lot of courses on areas of New Testament, church history, comparative religion, but especially like Reformation period, life and thought of Luther. I'm seeing. I mean, there's a pretty extensive faculty bio for you on Wisconsin Lutheran College's website, which I'll put a link in the show notes for those who want to get more familiar with your work. But today's episode, we're of course going to focus on the Life Under the Cross book. Again, like I said a little bit ago, James and I have been uh, just the last couple of months kind of in and I don't know what exactly started this, James, but you and I just got interested in Lutheranism after Luther because we talk, we're a Reformation themed podcast. We talk a lot about Martin Luther on this show, but I didn't realize just the factionalism and the
Mm-hmm.
the personalities. That I knew known some names, Martin Chemnitz. I knew the name Flacius, even if didn't always pronounce it right. But I didn't really know the details of the disputes, the controversies, and whatnot. And so once it was before I read your book. I know James has read some stuff too, if he cares to share of any of it. But I know he and I both looked at. I know I definitely looked at the Robert Kolb book, the Bound Choice, Free
Outright.
Will, the Wittenberg Theological Method, which is a much more academic work than your work is super accessible, which is something I want to highlight in this episode. Um, but that book by Kolb, which you do reference here and there, really, it's kind of, I would say in the English speaking language, it's kind of, it's
Yeah.
the go-to, it's a very authoritative source for if you really want to get into the weeds of what we've been calling, James and I here, second generation Lutheranism. And what I like about your book, even though it's about this one man, I didn't realize until reading your book that by zeroing in on this one person on Flacius, sorry, you can like tell a lot, maybe not the full story, but a whole lot of the story of what we'd call generation Lutheran just by looking at him. Um, how did you get interested in him? I should ask.
Yeah. So, and that's a very astute observation. I think you're exactly right about how it's kind of like if this were Adam Sandler movies and you get certain of his friends that just they pop up in all the movies and sometimes they're more prominent, sometimes they're in the background, but they're always going to be there. That's kind of between Luther's death and the Formula of Concord, you're going to see this Illyrian popping up in one way or another. I got interested in him because I was actually down in St. Louis with a Missouri Synod pastor friend, and we were just bumming around in the library, and he introduced me to another friend who just happened to be there. And incidentally, as Missouri Synod Lutherans do, I guess, they started talking about the Formula of Concord, because why not? And one of them referenced this footnote in the Cole Wengert edition of the Formula of Concord, and it had to do with Flacius, and it was on Article 10, the adiaphorist controversy. And I thought, you know what, that's pretty interesting, and I got to write a paper for the seminar class I'm in. That'd be a pretty good topic, and so I ran with it, and then I just became fascinated first with the adiaphorist controversy, but then with kind of this guy who seemed to be a main player in it. That led to being interested in the Formula of Concord, and then with all these articles, I kept noticing Flacius keeps popping up, either as the good guy or the bad guy. Usually the good guy, but in one glaring instance, the bad guy, misunderstood incident, but still he should have just known when to say when. And that got me interested in him himself. So my dissertation actually was comparative. It was on adiaphora and Flacius in Germany, and then John Hooper in England. And so this is the book Devil Behind the Surplice, my dissertation in book form. And they both object to the surplice, which Flacius doesn't object to it because he always thinks it's wrong, but in the circumstances. Hooper in England under Edward, they want to make him a bishop. Cranmer and Ridley want to make him a bishop. He says, I'll only become a bishop if you don't make me wear the surplice or shave my beard. And they do eventually let him keep his beard. But he actually goes to jail. He goes to the Tower, goes to the Fleet prison because he refuses to wear this. But they both are objecting to this for very different reasons. Hooper had been in exile in Zurich, and so I kind of view him right as how did he imbibe Zwingli and Bullinger and his approach to this, and then how did Flacius approach this? And it was really fun to look at how adiaphora, things that are supposed to be indifferent, can provide a lens into one full theology, which is, you mentioned Lutheranism after Luther in these years between the Formula and Luther's death. To me, this is when Lutheranism is most fun because you see its best and worst impulses all in play. And it's the adiaphoristic controversy, this fight over adiaphora, that reveals the fault lines on all these other teachings as well. And because Flacius is so involved in the adiaphoristic controversy, he ends up involved in all the others. And you know, I found him fascinating. His love for the scriptures, his commitment to Luther, but also his stubbornness. Like there's times where you're just like, you know, Matty boy, like calm down, you know.
Yeah.
And so I find him to be such a fascinating and relatable individual too. And then as you dig into his life, he's in many ways a father of modern hermeneutics. He writes his Clavis, which is this
You said
brilliant human,
father of modern hermeneutics. Yeah.
yeah, biblical hermeneutics with his Clavis, key to the sacred scriptures, church history. That's a pretty big thing to be a father of, and he's that with the Magdeburg Centuries and some of his other works, patristics with his catalog of true testimonies and other things. He's got his finger in all these fields. His glosses on the Old and New Testament, biblical commentary. He's a Hebrew professor, and so he really. You mentioned me teaching a variety of courses, and that's not by choice. When I was just a new guy for a while, and they kept giving me what they didn't want. But then I've also got to grow into some classes I want to teach, and sometimes I go, man, how am I supposed to stay a week ahead of the students and all these different things? And he just did that. And in so many ways, I find it fascinating and impressive. And I think sometimes to a fault, he failed to understand not everyone was doing that. And so he ends up just not understanding that everybody has the same bandwidth or is thinking through the same things in the same way and zeroes in. And I think that proves to be some of his professional way doing. That's a long answer. I don't know if it's worth much, but
No, that's fine. I
Yeah.
thought, James, you went and got some books.
Oh yeah, I the
okay,
the
yeah,
other two
nice.
books, The Devil Behind the Surplice and Uncompromising Gospel, and I have a Kindle version of your commentary on Mark. Um, but yeah, I really I actually learned about Flacius a few years ago, because I was accused by an ELCA pastor of being Nasio-Lutheran.
Mm.
And I think he meant it maybe as a compliment, also maybe confusing that I'm Episcopalian and probably more Lutheran than some of the people that he works with. But I really fell in love with the way that Flacius thinks. He is, like you said, very relatable. But I even have maybe more sympathy than some with the major controversy, not the adiaphoristic controversy, but the original sin controversy with Striegel, because as you say in an uncompromising gospel, um, at heart he's right, but with his language he's wrong. And I know that's preempting what we're going to talk about, he after Luther, the second generation Lutherans, Flacius is probably my favorite.
Oh,
Uh,
wow. Wow.
yeah.
Well, that is great to hear.
I don't know if I have a favorite of the second generation's Lutherans yet, but like I said, it's kind of a, at least speaking for me, I know James might have been into it longer. It's more of a recent interest for me, but it's grown on me. It's kind of like, this is going to be a silly analogy, maybe fun comparison, maybe. But kind of like how it's almost like The Godfather and Godfather, like Luther's story is like The Godfather Part One. It's a classic, and for a while, personally, I like those movies, so that's why I'm using this comparison. I always preferred the first one, but then like part two, it goes in this direction, kind of a dark direction. That things get more complicated, and they're not. It's not the good old days anymore. But for some reason, that movie has grown on me more than the first one. Now I would say part two is my. So something similar is happening with life and ministry of Luther being the part one of the Lutheran story,
Yeah.
from his death to the Formula of Concord, second generations being that second part of the story. And yeah, I don't know. And maybe toward the end of the episode, I'll ask you to. I know you had some footnotes and resources. You had a bibliography in this book, and I'd be interested in reading more about it from others. But it's funny, James, you mentioned ELCA. So James and I both. James, I think you were in seminary, you were attending an ELCA church for part of that time.
In college.
College. And
Mhm.
I basically went to an ELCA seminary because the Episcopal seminary I went to was at the time at Trinity Lutheran in Columbus. And I remember ELCA, Flacius was brought up in seminary a couple times. You probably predict in a negative light, or not in the light. He was brought up as a dark, figure, but and I wonder, and your book is good with trying to be holistic in your assessment of him. What were some of his weaknesses, his faults?
Yeah, it's interesting. You see this with Luther, and you see it with Flacius also, that I have found that those who write on him reveal as much about themselves as they do about him, because he's the kind of figure that you're gonna latch onto for a reason. You get interested in him for a reason, and so I would say that what I would say are shortcomings in Flacius are actually very personal shortcomings that I share and I've had to learn in ministry. Um, I think that he often um, entered into debates or situations without taking it into account if everyone else had prepared or thought through everything in the same way as him for that. And if everybody wasn't right there already, um, I think there was impatience with getting them caught up. Um, with peers, that is, at least. I don't necessarily mean with the laity, uh, but especially with peers. I think that a strength and a weakness for him was the way in which he identified himself with both his teachers, with Luther and Melanchthon. And he really is more of a Melanchthonian in method uh, than following Luther. But he identified with both of them in ways that I think led him to sometimes think there was more at stake in something, the whole of the Reformation maybe, in something that didn't have to have all of that in stake, and it blew up too much. The strength of that, though, was there were times where he recognized there was a whole lot more at stake than what people
Yeah.
thought, right? So he had the ability to both sometimes blow something up into a greater controversy than it had to be, but he also had the ability to sometimes recognize the seriousness of a controversy and want to address it.
Yeah.
And then I think just the third, and this would definitely be a personal feeling I have as well, was stubbornness. That it took him a long time sometimes to come around to um, accepting correction, uh, partly because so, I don't know if we're going to talk about original sin. He, but James mentioned, he's defending the right thing, right? So he's partly stubborn because he's defending the right thing, but he sticks to his language on it, right? Too much. And there are, he has brothers who reach out and are just like, just don't say it that way. But he can't escape from himself, I think, in that instance. That would be, I think, where maybe perhaps shortcomings would be, but nothing of which I accuse him there. None of that is anything I wouldn't say I find in myself as well, which is partly probably my interest in it.
Yeah. Well, you definitely bring the pastor's touch to the book. We always have to learn, oftentimes the hard way, that it's there's a art to concord, right? Everyone doesn't just
Yep.
enter a room with the
Yep.
same thing in their head and the same understanding of things, and yeah, and yeah, I mean, but I think that's also the you mentioned how both a strength and a weakness of Flacius was the same thing, because for me, when I'm reading about him, a potential flaw could be like he's willing to die on like every hill.
Yes. Yes.
But that can be like you said, in some instances, making something a big deal because it is a big deal. No one else is making it a big deal, but people need to recognize the seriousness of it. He
Yep.
was he was prone to that was prone to being a strength in that area. But then also, yeah, there's times when a lot of times where you don't need, like you said, you don't just it doesn't need to be as serious
Right.
as he made it to be. So I I like that's a good example, or that's a good illustration of you know the tragic aspect, I think,
Yeah.
because you know um things got the best of him at times, and then he was in the right and many times too, and sadly a lot of people may not recognize it.
Yeah. And he and Philip, he and Melanchthon are both lay theologians. They're not ordained, they're not pastors. And I think that also shows itself sometimes in their approach to things.
Sure.
They're in the academy, and sometimes that's a real strength because kind of at a very high level they're able to see something that maybe others aren't noticing. But I the parish has a way of tempering things in us and reminding us, they didn't hear confessions. They weren't on the ground level in the same way that someone like a Bugenhagen or a Luther who's doing more parish ministry um, would have been. And so when we're dealing sometimes with things more in the abstract or just more academically, we can inflate them and forget
Yeah.
you know um, the relational aspects that are involved.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I think about when I think about Philip Melanchthon is that he has one of the failings of many pastors, which is that they try so hard to reconcile two parties that they end up compromising too much. And I think that's something that definitely couldn't be said about Flacius because I kind of every time I read your Key of the Sacred Scriptures or with the primer on the Key to the Sacred Scriptures. Um And when I've read that and other quotations and stuff from here and there, I feel like Flacius's personality is a lot like Paul in Galatians. Very polemical, very hard-hitting, sometimes sarcastic, but also deeply theologically grounded
Yep.
and ultimately right. But when he tells the Galatians to castrate themselves, like
Yeah. Yeah.
maybe that's a bridge too far. Like,
Yeah.
but that's kind of what I think about when I think about Flacius.
I always love to picture Paul at that point, pacing and he's dictating to Silas or whoever, and he drops the "I wish they'd go all the way and emasculate themselves," and Silas kind of being like, Paul, that's going to be scripture. And I was like, yeah, I know, but I think I like that comparison, and I would say that, my impression of Galatians, in teaching it too, is that the the tone of the letter is contrary to Paul's natural temperament. You don't get the impression that Paul was just a boisterous guy who was going around. And I really think that's true of Flacius too. I think in person, in everyday interaction, he would not have come across as big of a personality that he seems through his writings and in controversy. In fact, um, everybody seemed to get along with him just fine until the adiaphorus of controversy. So I don't think this was a. Sometimes people will, I think, assume, well, this just must have been his temperamental disposition, and I don't think it was naturally so for him. And I mean, I get that impression with Paul too. I think Paul much more enjoyed writing Colossians or Ephesians than Galatians, but he had to write Galatians.
The so kind of getting into Flacius, in some of the chronology into some of his life, where does he come from? And you speak about some of his influences in the book. Can you kind of share about that? Um, I know his origins are unique because he's not a German,
Right.
uh, too. So as far as if he's one of the many German reformers who's not technically German, but yeah.
Yeah. So he's uh, born in what would be modern day Croatia, a beautiful little town today called Labine, and he's born to kind of like Luther, kind of like of a middling sort parent. So his father's going to oversee his early education, which means he kind of had the ability to do so. If I'm recalling, his mother maybe a little bit more well-born than his father, but a family that was kind um, of somewhat importance and trying to increase its importance, its role. This was under the influence of Venice, this area at that time. We sometimes forget that the Italian city-states had their own little empires, which I put the quotes for listeners, because it's not that impressive of an empire compared to some, but more of an empire than I've ever had. So it's still something. And so he later will go to Venice for his education, and he's educated under some very gifted humanists in Venice, and that training will shape his whole future life. He really spends the last decades of his life supporting himself with book selling. He's very good at building networks and finding manuscripts and authenticating manuscripts and recognizing the value of something from the past to be um, promulgated again in the present. And so that Venetian training will be very important. Uh, he gets interested in the scriptures while he's in Venice. How theological was he at that point? It's hard. It's like with Luther or anyone else too. To what extent are they reading back into their past, um, you know, stuff, and to what extent was it there? But he's interested enough that he's thinking about becoming a friar, so he can become a theologian, that he can be theologically educated. And he had a relative through marriage in the family of Aldo Lupino who actually ends up martyred later under the Venetian Inquisition. And he talks to him and he says, uh, I'd like to study theology, thinking about joining the Franciscans or whoever. And Lupino says to him, go north, study under the evangelicals. And so Flacius does that. And he goes north and he makes his way through Basel and through Tübingen and Augsburg and studies a little at some of these places. And really, I mean, this is again why I think his disposition could not have been too combative, because he really makes a lot of friends when he goes places. He establishes quite a network, and these are Reformed people, or I'm sorry, we Lutherans call everybody who's not Lutheran Reformed. So, um, the these are non-Lutheran, right, evangelical, and he's getting along with them, right? He goes to Wittenberg and begins his studies, but he is a non-German in what becomes a very German uh, set of controversies, Lutheran, but also thoroughly German. And he is at times mocked for that. Um, Even Melanchthon, I believe, I'd have to find the citation now, will play on the relationship between Slav and slave. He obviously got by in German, and he wrote a fair amount in German. And I love reading his German because it's how I would write German if I were him and it weren't my main language. But he kind of says again and again, man, I wish a German would fight this fight and be doing this stuff, but I guess I'll have to do it. He's never he's always I say Croatian, I'm being anachronistic. He's always an Illyrian in Germany. So even when the Adiaphragmatic controversy breaks out and he's looking for places to go from Wittenberg, I love that he at first goes to Magdeburg and it's like everything would be perfect there, but I can't eat that food. It's all just northern food. And so he's going to end up coming back later. But he's a Southern European. Later in life, when he kind of has to wander a bit, he wants to found an academy to bring the Reformation to Southern Europe, to train up pastors, a printing press aimed at his homeland. And so he's very much shaped by where he's from, and that Lupitino is drowned by the Venetian Inquisition leaves a mark on him too. He had a dear friend who was a martyr. And so not only are Luther and Melanchthon important, but he knows people from his home who shared his theological sympathies are subject to torture and death.
So he ends up in Wittenberg, this foreigner, but he becomes I didn't realize how that him and Melanchthon were so close in the beginning. Your
Yeah,
book
yeah,
pointed that out, and there's some overlap of, again, we're talking second generation Lutheran guy. There's some overlap with him in Luther's life because Luther's still alive. He was able to do some studies in Wittenberg under Luther and
yeah,
Melanchthon, right?
yeah. Luther and Melanchthon attend his wedding. Yep.
Okay, yeah, that's right. And yeah, your book pointed that out. So he's in Wittenberg. He gets a post there. He's teaching there, right? That's one
Yeah,
of
yeah. He again, this is a lot of similarities to Melanchthon. His abilities uh, seem to have been recognized pretty early on. His abilities with language, he must have come across to have at least decent skills in instruction. And so he becomes pretty early on while he's still studying. Um, he becomes a professor of Hebrew at Wittenberg. So I mean, he is for having been an outsider. This is the tragedy to me: is he had to feel like everything had just fallen in place, right? And life was good. Melanchthon plays a role in setting him up with his wife, right? Like he is. This is, and we forget. Wittenberg is somehow for this, podunk town, just has a collection of gifted people, men and women, these theologians and pastors and their wives. And uh, someone to write a book on the wives, the interactions you get from some of the letters and stuff. It's fascinating. This is a stimulating place. This is a vibrant place. This is a place that it's not just a well-known university. It's a recently well-known university because of the things happening. And yeah, so he ends up teaching there. He's teaching Hebrew. This is a big thing because, right, Hebrew is a language that's kind of renewed interest in. There was a lot of skepticism about Hebrew. Yeah, his thesis is great because he's actually wrong, but he's
Oh
right in
yeah,
his
his
concern. He
thesis
has,
where he argued that the vowel markings in the Hebrew Old
yeah,
Testament were there from the beginning. Yeah,
yeah,
that's
because the Roman Catholics were saying, well, if the Masoretes could add the pointing, then see the church stands over Scripture.
yeah.
And so again, he recognized there's we don't want to concede it, that apologetic to them, but and he did the best with what he had. I have logos or whatever, I
Yeah.
got advantages.
So I think it's while he's at Wittenberg, fast forwarding a little bit, well, several pivotal things take place on the larger scale that set things in motion, including kind of introducing these controversy. I mean, the wider geopolitical situation and this tension between these, um, you know, principalities that want to reform the church versus, the empire, the emperor, for the highest authority on their higher authority, their higher earthly authority, of course. Um, After Luther's death, things just really start to get intense in that area. And can you tell us about the Schmalkaldic League? We haven't even brought that up. We did a couple episodes now on this, second generation Lutheranism, and but the Schmalkaldic League and its defeat. Um, can you kind of walk us
Sure.
through that?
So Charles V is the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. And Charles V, if it weren't for his persecution of Lutherans, was a guy I would love to hang out with. I think he was a very sincere and pious guy in a number of ways. The fact that he wanted to eliminate my confession of the faith would have been awkward, but otherwise, um, I think he's trying to do a very sincere thing. I listened to an interview once with a Habsburg, Charles V was from the Habsburg family, still alive today, very pious Roman Catholic, right? The Habsburgs who had managed to be Holy Roman emperors for centuries up till more recent history, they saw themselves as being responsible for defending and supporting the Roman Catholic Church in their land. And Charles V rules more of Europe than almost anyone else in all of history, because you have Habsburg, Spain, and Germany, Central Europe, Austria. Uh, for our listeners, just Google Charles V map, Holy Roman Empire, and if you're not familiar, you'll be shocked. That being said, he was not Holy Roman Emperor like Joe Biden or Donald Trump, our president. And Donald Trump and Joe Biden aren't president like many people were kings throughout history. We have um, federal government, state government, local government, and then we've got checks and balances. Charles V was even less able to act than our executive branch, because he was dependent for taxes and troops on these subsidiary or other principalities. They weren't all considered themselves subsidiary. And so they'd have to have these congresses. This is where Reichstag comes from, Empire days. Imagine if the U.S. had movable congresses, and like Congress meets in Dubuque one year, Saginaw, 2 years later, and this was important for him and for the other rulers, right, to forge this relationship. The Lutherans are up against Charles V. They know if he gets the chance at some point, he's going to want to restore the Roman Church in all the territories for which he feels he has responsibility. And so there is a desire amongst, if I can say, Protestant in the Big Ten, meaning Reformed and Lutheran, right? And no offense to non-Lutherans, right? But everybody takes our terms. So we were the evangelicals, we were the Protestants, and now, evangelical means an American Republican, Christian voter, and Protestant just means anything from Jehovah Witness to,
Right.
the spaghetti monster, but not Roman Catholic spaghetti monster or whatever. So the non-Roman Catholics, the evangelicals, the Protestants, Big Tent, they're figuring, how are we going to defend ourselves if we have to? And there's just some Lutherans who are not going to enter a defensive alliance that doesn't have a unified confession of the faith. So the Schmalkaldic League is the Lutheran attempt to have a unified defensive alliance that also is based on a shared confession of the faith. the Augsburg Confession. And so it's a Lutheran defensive alliance, which for the most part acts defensively, except for one little incident where they have a little fun, but we all have our days, right? And their main goal is to be like NATO, right? NATO doesn't want to have to fight. NATO wants to avoid fights by existing. Well, the Schmalkaldic League was hoping maybe this defensive alliance of some pretty important territory, since Saxony was a very important territory at the time, maybe this will avoid war. Well, Luther dies, and there's a bunch of events that come together. The emperor now has the moment because France and the Turks are not bothering him too much. You know, he's gone into Italy and dealt with that. He turns his attention to Lutheran Germany, and some Lutherans, in order to get political gain, say, okay, yep, we'll help you, or at least not fight against you. And the Schmalkaldic League is defeated, partly because the Saxony that Luther was from had to fight on two fronts because there's two Saxonies, long story. The other Saxony, Moritz, who was in charge of that, sides with the emperor, and now you've got enemies on two sides. This defeat now means the future of Lutheranism is up for grabs. The emperor had made some promises to the Lutherans that he got to fight with him or to not fight, that they would still be able to be Lutherans. But he decides what we're going to do is have what's called this Augsburg interim, which will require certain ceremonies and jurisdiction. And that will be the way that we get Rome back into these territories. And some will argue these are just ceremonies and jurisdictions. This is not doctrine. It's no big deal. Even Melanchthon, who later ends up disputing with Flacius and others, says, nope, we're rejecting the Augsburg interim. But Moritz, who was Lutheran but had turned against the Schmalkaldic League, he needs some way to keep the emperor happy. And so he tasked the Wittenberg theologians who had not left with what becomes the Leipzig proposal, and we'll call it that to be fair, because that's what it was. Flacius dubbed it the Leipzig interim, and history calls it that. Kind of like who's that guy for the Bulls that got posterized in we call that the G League for the NBA, and where all the rookies, and this poor kid, for all we know, he's gonna be a great basketball player, but he just got dunked on it. The moment you see the picture, you're like, that's gonna be a meme, right? And so he's gonna not live that down. That's the Leipzig interim. The name just sticks, right? It's meant to be a proposal, though, of what can we compromise in order to keep the emperor happy, in order to preserve Wittenberg and Lutheranism. And that's going to involve what they call adiaphora, right? So the Schmalkaldic League, we're going to defend against the emperor coming in. Emperor defeats them. There is now no mechanism for political military defense of the Lutheran Confession of the Faith, right? There's no protection for these institutions. And everyone has to decide, do we compromise or not compromise, and to what degree? During this time, there is persecution. There's pastors having to live in the woods, stuff like that. The further south and west you go in Germany, the worse it tended to be. The more north you went, the more you could a little bit be stubborn and try the don't tread on me thing, with varied success. But the Luther's death and the Schmalkaldic League defeat are the two big traumas that give way to everything that follows for the next decade.
And it's it kind of, now they're very vulnerable basically without this kind of buffer against the emperor. And I think your book really brings out, because I think, and we'll get into what Nasio-Lutheran versus, I guess, Philippist or non-Nasio-Lutheran, what that fully means in a moment. But this factionalism that arises in the second generation Lutherans, you have, for better or worse, for lack of better terms, hardliners versus moderates. And I like the sympathy. You give a certain level of sympathy with the moderates because you say, I think you point out how the influence of the emperor's stranglehold now on the reason why a lot of these moderates were moderates, it'd be people just like us if we were in this situation.
Right.
having to act under pressure. It's not merely a case of like loose, you know, good, loosey-goosey compromise on the part of a, wishy-washy kind of ecumenism. It's, people in very vulnerable places that, you know, uh, to read charitably, these people who are willing to make concessions were very concerned about the survival of Christ of their
Yeah,
fellow
not
Christians.
just their
So,
personal survival, but of Lutheranism. Yeah,
right, yeah,
I was I was reading. I don't know why I was reading this. I don't know how I even found it, but this report, and it was from the Pacific Front in World War II, and there was a survey of soldiers' initial reaction to battle, and I can't remember the numbers, but there was an insanely high number of soldiers that admitted to soiling themselves,
hmm.
right? Which
So
means it was
you
common.
said they admitted to soiling themselves. Yeah.
Yeah, I would have
Okay.
put it a different way, but
No, no,
I don't.
you faded out, and I'm pretty sure it's what you said. And
Okay,
yeah, no.
yeah. I was trying to censor myself and getting. I don't know what level of colorful Episcopalians are okay with. So, but they went to the bathroom in their pants, and enough of them must have done it that in the survey they were willing to admit to it, right? Because I normally in a survey I wouldn't admit to something like that, even if it were true. And that struck me because, we like to think you watch a World War II movie or young people think if they went off to war, they think of all the grand things they would do, right? This is their moment. They'd be courageous. What would most of us actually do? We would soil ourselves before anything else, right? Because things just got real.
Yeah.
My stomach and heart are being tested. And so I think we do a real disservice if we try to have the black hat, white hat cowboys in this, and then read back into it the reaction we think we would have.
Yeah.
Right? I have had times in my ministry where I thought I was Luther informed over the dumbest thing ever. And I look back and I'm just embarrassed. Who am I to think I would actually have been Luther informed, right? And not just have fainted. And so, yeah, these gentlemen are trying to be faithful to Luther's legacy and to the confession of the scriptures and to maintain the good things that Reform had brought to the extent that they could. So it's not that they're acting simply out of fear, although there's probably an element to that. Lots of those soldiers who soiled themselves fought hard and survived, or they couldn't have taken the survey, right? So maybe there was some fear, but they also this route was not without risk. They also, Melanchthon, we sometimes will say, well, he didn't have the stomach of a martyr, but Melanchthon being at Wittenberg is a great story too, because he had the opportunity to leave when things started to heat up, right? His uncle Reuchlin was very influential in academia, as we would call it today. He could have got another gig, and he chooses to stay and kind of marries himself to the gospel and this reform movement. This is a man who had committed himself to the free and full forgiveness of sin, and so I think it would be unfair to simplify
Yeah.
the nature of what they're doing.
All kinds of like notable institutions wanted Melanchthon to come teach,
Yeah,
and
he could have been in England. Yeah,
he stayed in this podunk town. Yeah, as you call it, podunk. And no, you can say soil. It was just I couldn't hear it. A few episodes ago I said shit, and I didn't
well,
say.
that's what I was gonna say, but I didn't know what I
Well,
was permitted. So
I didn't say shit. I said the actual word that shit forms.
yeah, yeah,
Uh,
yeah,
but I was actually doing it. I was doing it in quotations from Amy Montravati's book. I'm sure you know her because you both work
yeah,
at
yeah.
1517.
The
So yeah,
broken bonds. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah. So yeah, we'll just yeah, don't hold back on this show. James, you were gonna say something, James?
That it is reasonably good to be fair to both sides in this because we don't know how we would respond, and I think that I probably would have been a more moderating voice, even though I know that in most of these instances, the Gnasio-Lutherans were right. Um, but I don't know. I think one of the things that you said about the adiaphoristic controversy, the Leipzig proposal, was that Melanchthon actually tried to sort of press his differing view of justification in the Leipzig proposal, um, which led more to a kind of synergistic look at justification. We're not actually a block of wood on which God acts. Um, so while I would say that, he's trying to be moderating, I would also say he's also being a bit self-serving, and in the end, I think he's actually very wrong. And that's one of the areas where I am strongly on the side of the Gnasio-Lutherans.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and I would agree with that assessment. Part of the challenge is to read the adiaphoristic controversy without knowing everything that comes after it.
mhm.
And I would absolutely agree, and I think I point out in the book, I know I do in other writings, that the statement on justification is terribly ambiguous at best. And the thing we have to remember is that Philip had a history of tinkering with things, and to try to put things in a way that could confess truth, but also um, foster conversation. How would I say like that? That sounds terribly 20th century, hippie-ish. And so I don't know that the men crafting the Leipzig proposal would have done it in the light or seen it in the light of all the fights that developed. But you're exactly right. These fights all come out of the Leipzig proposal. So even George Major, who's going to get in trouble for how he talked about good works, I don't know that he ever would have said what he later said about good works if he wasn't trying to defend what was said in the Leipzig proposal. And I think that does play out with justification and other things too. The shift in language was already there in the Lotzi from Melanchthon though before this. Yeah, but I would absolutely agree with your assessment. It's amazing how quickly the very heart and core of Scripture um, gets put up for debate, unintentionally as it might have been, um, through the compromises that were made.
Yeah.
What and from what I can tell, Flacius's hardline stance on the Leipzig proposal is also directly related to the later controversy about original sin.
Yep, yep,
Because if
yeah,
human beings have no agency in salvation whatsoever, which is what he's arguing in the adiaphoristic controversy, at least in that portion of it, then how do you talk about that ontologically? Why don't we have agency? And
right.
that I think would you say that those two are connected in that way?
Yeah, I, for for Flacius, I think everything becomes a debate about justification by grace through faith. Because, and I think he's very similar to Melanchthon in method, but I think this is a proclivity that he shared with Luther, is that they immediately went to how does this implicate to how Christ and his work gets to us and what it means for us. And I want to be fair to Philip. I don't want Scott Keith from 1517 getting mad at me. And, the very good Melanchthon scholar, and I appreciate his work. And I think he would agree with me. That Melanchthon is a much better systematician than Luther. He's much more organized in his thinking. And even in his approach, right, the Lotzi or Loki or Loci method, we can debate pronunciations if we want, is, right, topics. We're going to take these commonplaces or topics and address them. Well, to do that, you have to kind of be like modern medicine where one person specializes, right? I deal with feet, and then, oh, well, you got a back problem. Now you have to go to the back. And you have to kind of step back in a way and consider each of those things. Flacius and Luther always ask how it's much more like a wheel than pizza, right? Pizza and a wheel or a bicycle wheel are the same shape, but you can take a piece of pizza, right, one at a time. A bicycle wheel is no good if you take the hub, right? When you get your pizza and they put that little circle thing in the middle, I don't know what that's for, but you ever get that? I think it keeps the
Yeah.
box from collapsing. What do?
Right.
You take right? That you can take out, and in fact, you sometimes have to remove it to eat the pizza. Um, and that's somewhat how some Lutherans, the approach to doctrine will apply, is we can individually analyze these things. For Lutheran Flacius, that it's like taking what is this going to, are you taking the hub out of the bicycle wheel, right? Or even the spokes, you take enough spokes and the wheel's going to be like a potato chip. And so I think Flacius is seen where this goes, as Amsdorff will, and Amsdorff will be very important for all of this. Whereas some of the Philippists, which you pointed out in your episode on second generation Lutherans, I really appreciated. These are anachronistic terms. In fact, none of us even know where I have yet to find anything conclusive on the various terms that get used, especially Gymnasial Luther. I would love to just have to know, okay, who came up with it, exactly what. But there is, and I think you see this develop in Lutheranism over time into the kind of the mess you get in the 18th and 19th century. There's more of a belief that you can stand over Scripture objectively than you'll see in Luther, where you're standing under Scripture, right? Right, when I say stand over it objectively, I mean that, like, I can somehow remove myself and just stand over it and think abstractly. That's not in Luther and Flacius. I think partly because both did face melancholy and had to have the gospel applied and realize this was the heart and core of where the rubber hits the road. I don't mean to put down Lutheran scholasticism and other things that would develop later, but I don't think that develops without some of the conviction that I can maybe stand over doctrine in a way that Lutheran Flacius were unable personally to do.
Yeah. And I noticed that too. I mean, I think even like the Lutheran and to their credit, Reformed scholastics of the 17th century, I guess that wouldn't even be second generation Lutherans. That'd be like fourth, fifth, sixth generation, whatever.
Yeah.
I know they try their efforts are to make doctrine holistic. But even they might, it still comes off sometimes as pieces of pizza. While with Flacius and Luther, yeah, it was they didn't examine things in parts. It was kind of like it all came together. I want to share if you don't mind, I want to share the quote from page 68 of your book, which you just echoed, you paraphrase, whatever you articulated very well here, but I really think because one of my questions was going to be, and I think instead of asking the question, you could still add, instead of asking the question, I could just read this. My question originally was going to be, what was at the heart of the Nasio-Lutheran versus the non-Nasio-Lutheran party? But I'll just read this quote because I think it points it out. Justification was not one teaching among others for Flacius and the Nasio-Lutherans. It was the hub of the wheel, as you just said, the teaching from which all the others emerged like spokes, forming one complete, indivisible wheel. Doctrine was a unity, a totality for them. Rather than doctrines, plural, they could speak just as often or more often about doctrine, singular. Justification, moreover, was not simply a teaching. Justification was the work of Christ. It is what he came from heaven to earth to do. Christ was the sinner's justification. He was the Son, and doctrine and practice emanated from him like rays. Sun, S-U-N. An assault on doctrine and practice then was not an isolated thing. It was an attack on Christ and his work, justification. I think that sums it up real well. I mean, obviously, there's still the debate of like, well, there are still things that are secondary, not essential, and so how does that relate to something that, because obviously a hub, a wheel implies it's all essential. So, but there's obviously that question still. But I really liked that what you said there in the book, and I think that does. Would there be anything you would add to what was at heart of the debate between the Nasio-Lutherans, which were also called problematically Flacians, kind of like
Yeah.
people in Wittenberg sitting around the table with Philip were called pejoratively the Philippists, the
Yeah.
people, that were, and it's not just Flacius. I mean, Amsdorf was kind of the grandfather of this, which I wanted to ask a question about him. But I'll say with this first question, was there anything else at heart you think of the debate between the Nasio Lutherans and the non?
I I think it. I mean, I think that captures. It is largely about justification. Um, how Christ's work gets to me, right, and what it means for me, and to the degree that it means that. So you mentioned Dr. Kolb's book. That really is a great source, a resource on all of this, and you know that he talks about found choice in it, and that who's choosing matters most. It plays such a role, and that it's God choosing of me. And so, yeah, I would say it largely ends up being a fight about justification, but also, again, how we relate to Scripture.
Mhm.
Everyone believes that the Scripture, everybody involved in this believes the Scripture are the ultimate authority. They believe in, um, you know, it's the final authority. Uh, but the way I relate to it, um, the way to which it can be a subject, right, that I'm studying, I think maybe there was some disagreement as well.
Sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I think we're probably at time, but again, I recommend listeners, you got kind of a taste, which is what I wanted. I didn't want to spoil, hoping not to spoil too much. And obviously, this is history, so you could always, go and see the basic. I mean, Flacius does die. I don't think there's any spoiler there, though he's alive in Christ now. So, but it's a good
Depending on who
biography.
you ask, yeah,
Good biography. Good shows his short book. The concise in many ways, but um, explains in very accessible, explains in finer detail, but in an interesting way, these different theological controversies that emerge between these two main factions of Lutheranism. Flacius, of course, being very much a leader on one of those sides, and Amsdorf, which we didn't get too much to, but I think he's grown to be kind of because I didn't realize how much of a OG
yeah,
origin.
he's the granddaddy of Gnaeo Lutheranism. Yeah,
Yeah, he went to, and I brought it out in the last episode when I first really came across him in Kolb's work. And Kolb did a whole book about him. I just discovered.
yeah. Kolb's book on him is really good.
Is
Yeah,
it good? Okay, I'll have to check it. Because, I
that's
mean, yeah,
also available from CPH. I think that I could be wrong. I think that um, a large part of his doctoral work was focused on Amsdorf specifically. Yeah.
okay. And I'm going to be such a nerd for bringing this up. There's a Martin Luther video game. Well,
Uh-uh.
it's not a video game, it's an app. James, did you end up downloading it?
No, I haven't downloaded it
It's
yet.
silly. It's
Yeah.
kind of like Oregon Trail where you have to like people are just
Really?
on a trail and you have to keep them alive. It's like that,
I'm gonna have to
but
look for this.
Luther and his I'll email you it's on the App Store for I think it's on
Okay.
I have it on iPhone, but I played it once, I never but it's yeah, you have to it's Luther and his people, his party after the Worms and the emperors declared him, you can kill him on sight and you have to get him to safety. It's so silly.
Yeah.
But it's his posse, and Amsdorf is one of the characters. So yeah,
Huh. Nice.
Amsdorf goes but way back with Luther, and he outlived Luther, and he's part of bringing it back to what on topic. He was also a significant leader in the Nasio Lutheran faction, and so it's just
Yeah.
interesting to see these personalities and um yeah, very. And I liked Gallus too a lot. I think
Yeah.
he cleared up the whole straw man argument that they made again that they said the Nasio Lutherans just believe that we're all just blocks of wood that God acts upon like a puppet master rather than living, moving beings with a will. Gallus, his analogy of saying, no, our belief is actually that we're like children who need the constant parent. I really
Yeah.
felt that was a very, he dispelled that myth about them. Yeah,
Yeah.
I talked about that last episode, but yeah.
One day someone needs to write a book on the Eisenach Synod. Later, there's this debate. Manius picks up um, from Major about good works, kind of the theme, and there's this debate over the law. And Amsdorf and Flacius actually end up disagreeing. but it has really huge implications for how we understand what you're getting at there, kind of the view of how we should view this. And I think it'd be really fun for someone to work on. Yeah, Amsdorff is great. I mean, he's like the grandpa to all these guys, and
Yeah.
he keeps discordant personalities together in some impressive ways, but he was also capable himself of being cantankerous, and he's what you want in a grandpa. You
Mhm.
know, I really get a kick out of it.
Maybe James and I will go talk with Robert Cole about having him back. He's been on the show once, but
Yeah, I listen to it.
Amsdorff
Yeah,
Amsdorff might have come up. I really wish, I did that episode on my end kind of prematurely because I mean, really, it's been these past few months that I've been into this period. Now, I mean, I wish that's an episode I wish I could redo or have all pick his brain about maybe even more.
yeah.
So yeah,
Can I just one observation I'll place it before we wrap up, if that's okay?
yeah,
So I feel like I've said Lutheran a lot, and I'm coming from a very Lutheran perspective. But I appreciate your guys' interest in this, and I think somewhere where Protestants in general, and even Roman Catholics, where Flacius is a figure that I think can be helpful or revelatory in a number of ways, is Flacius is a very small C Catholic theologian. He is drawing on the best from church history. He wants to be consulting the fathers. He, in his hermeneutics and the clavis, right? We confess scripture alone, but he doesn't think he's reading scripture alone. He wants to hear the voice of the church. And he really believes in a church that didn't have a medieval rupture, that's always been there precisely because Christ justifies sinners, right? Because Christ has been there. And so I think he's wonderfully, um, he gives a good model in that way in many of his impulses. But then also we see the church will, and the apostles had this, right? It's also going to have its personalities, and so the church will always be messy too. And it's going to have its necessary divisions and debates. The most creative ages of church history, creative in a good way, also were in many ways the most divisive. I wish Flacius could have gone to the Council of Nicaea. It would have been so fun to see him, uh, to see him there. And so something that strikes me about the second generation, you guys may have already talked about this. I didn't hear it when I was listening, but most of these guys worked or went to school together at some point, and they studied the same men, under the same men, I should say. And so it just shocked them when they disagreed or fell on different sides of it.
Mm.
And it shocked them in very personal ways. And that's something that's always been true in the church as well, right? That we care about each other. We 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 believe in the mission of the church. We believe in the importance of the scriptures and our history. And so you can have that added dynamic of you're my friend. What I thought we believed the same things. What happened here? And so while he gets usually focused on for the divisive, like, oh, he was such a divisive figure, which I don't think he was. He wanted real unity. You see this great small C Catholic impulse, but you also see in this era of Lutheranism, um, all the factions that can grow in the church as well. And I mean, it there's lessons there that every age of the church
Yeah,
can benefit from considering.
yeah.
I don't know if
All
that makes sense, but I
No, it
think
does. I
Yeah.
think, yeah, all Christians have something to learn from the example, the story of Flacius, including, I mean, we're indebted to him with this this historical theology podcast. We're indebted to him. He's the father of historical theology,
yeah,
Flacius, and of course, I'll point listeners to the book to read more about that. But yeah, he was very influential in his writings, uh, including in that field. So,
yeah,
Wade, thank.
I would say
Oh,
that
go ahead.
Cranmer was doing it a little earlier though.
Okay, yeah.
Cranmer was doing that with his commonplaces that Ashley Null's been working on.
Oh, yeah.
He was
yeah,
compiling quotations from the fathers pertaining to Protestant commonplaces. So they were doing it, I guess, maybe concurrently, although he died in 1556,
Right.
and so Flacius died in
Yeah.
75.
Well, and I believe Ecolampadius was doing similar things.
Mhm.
But yet, from a Protestant viewpoint, we so often just concede to the Roman Catholics or the Eastern Orthodox, like, oh, church history, like that's their thing. This was a strong Protestant impulse, and they did not concede the fathers or concede continuity with the apostolic. And so there's a number of people who this is developing amongst at the same time, uh, and I always think that as Protestants, it's good for us to appreciate and remember that, and not just concede. Well, that's a Rome or a Constantinople thing.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So
Wade,
when are
thanks.
you gonna,
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, when are you going to finish translating the Clavis?
I would love to help someone with that. Uh, one half of the Clavis basically is a theological word book, um, which is fascinating to see how he defines, different words. But it's kind of more like a concordance word book, and I don't know the value of getting that, but there's a lot that it would be nice to have more. And at some point, I would like to translate more of what he says about allegory, just because it would, I think, fluster a lot of my circle of Lutherans, and it's always fun to poke bears. So maybe I'll do that next.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Well, Wade, thanks for coming on. It's been a great discussion, and your there's not a whole lot of, at least not in the American Anglosphere, of people just either doing the research or just presenting this story, these stories of people like outside of you. So, we're you know it's a gift to have your works and what you're currently working on. So thank you
Well,
for
thank you.
your.
And I would say, if readers want to read more about him, Oliver Olson has. It was meant to be 2 volumes of a biography. It's one. I don't think the second is ever going to come out. I was visiting Oliver not that long ago, and there were some computer issues and unfortunate things that I just don't know. But very good the first half, and then it's harder to get, a little bit more expensive. But Luka Ilic, who is a Croatian, who's a pastor in Germany, and has worked at the Leibniz Institute. He has hosted a number of conferences. A lot of it's not in English, but if someone has reading proficiency in some of these languages, but he does have a book, Theologian of Sin and Grace on Flacius, that is in English, and it is. You mentioned accessible and academic, and I very much was aiming for accessible. I want people to be interested, and this is meant to
Yeah.
be, to get them familiar. But for anyone who wants to dig deeper, I don't know when Lucas sleeps. It's amazing the amount of work he has done, and if you're looking for more stuff, the footnotes, etc. So Theologian of Sin and Grace, that's a great resource too. But I know I appreciate the kind words. I just
Oh
don't
yeah.
want to give the impression that I'm not definitely
Oh.
the junior voice
Oh, well,
in
and
some of
you
these.
and you give a lot of credit to them in the book too, and that's I remember I mentioned earlier we ended up coming back to, thankfully I wanted to ask you, further resources for people
Yeah,
that might want to dig deeper, especially into this area and into Flacius himself. So yeah. All right, well, God bless everyone. Thank you, James. Thank you, Wade. Great episode. I'll go ahead and end the recording.